Technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Chelsey Youman.
Well, happy Monday and welcome to today's edition of the Next Generation Roundtable. I'm so grateful you are spending, many of you, your first weeks back at work after the holidays with us this afternoon. We've got a lot of news, a lot of current events, and a lot of world events specifically to catch you up on after a few weeks that I hope you had spending a wonderful time celebrating Christmas with your friends and family. Joining us this first hour, we have Liberty McArtor. You know her well. She's a co-host of this show, but she's also the host of the Know Why podcast, where she talks about all types of issues from school and education to cultural from a biblical perspective. Thank you for being with us today, Liberty.
Thanks, Chelsey. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, and also to Patrina Mosley, who is joining us. She is a speaker, author, advocate, and founder and principal of PPM Consulting. She's really our political guru on the show, and I appreciate her voice so much, and also love having an all-women's roundtable this first hour. Thank you for joining us, Patrina.
Yes, happy to be here. Thank you.
It's going to be a very full hour as we're going to dive right in, speaking of really what potentially is looking like it will be a regime change for Venezuela after former President Maduro and his wife Cecilia Flores were arrested in the wee hours of the night by U.S. law enforcement in their home there in Venezuela. We're going to be covering that extensively this first hour. We'll also be turning our discussion to a little bit of news, really on the cultural front. We're talking about marriage and family and feminism. I think this first hour is going to be a really strong panel to have that discussion. And then in the second hour, don't go anywhere, because Ethan Watson will be joining us. We're going to talk about news out of Iran. And Neuralink has some pretty big announcements for us to be looking into this new year with. But let's dive right in, ladies. We're going to start with Venezuela. By now, I'm sure you have all heard the news there that the U.S. really carried out an outstanding and excellent campaign there in Caracas, Venezuela. Within 30 minutes, they were able to arrest the president there. And you also are aware of the 5 drug charges he's been charged with. Their federal crimes, including narco-terrorism, which it can be as high as a life sentence. I was personally driving this weekend to go camping with my family when I heard the news, and I think that Senator Lindsey Graham on Fox News last night said it really well, at least from my vantage point. He said, really the last time that we all saw a really big campaign like this, or something that made us think, wow, look at the strength and capability of our own military, were, for me, it was June when we successfully shut down Iran's nuclear complexes and had very targeted campaign there against that. But also, under the Biden administration, what we saw was a weakened military strategy. I think what stuck out in all of our minds, Lindsey Graham alluded to, was when we left Afghanistan, and it was clumsy at best, if not, willfully negligent and ill-prepared. But on the world stage, it was embarrassing. And the stark contrast under President Trump's administration of leading with strength first is, I think, a resounding really response to where we've been the last 4 years for the entire world. They're all paying attention now. Every single one of these, some of these are tyrants, dictatorships, the communist regime. They're all coming out with statements because I think they're running scared. Patrina, I'll start with you. Did you have the same response, or what were your thoughts when you initially heard about this?
Well, my initial thought was, great, another crazy item to add to the millennial timeline of our history. It just seems like I just can't catch a break. We've had, 9/11, 2 housing and stock market crashes, the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and just everything else that we just know that we've endured. And it just seems like we can't get a leg up from chaos. But on the flip side, yes, I do agree with you and with Lindsey Graham. This was a great show of strength, and really a great show of strength that I haven't seen since June with Iran, but also since 9/11. And for me personally, that was my first introduction into politics. Is when I realized that America is vulnerable unless the Lord protects the house, unless the Lord builds it right. It's going to be built in vain. It's going to be protected in vain. And that's when, at 11 years old, I believe, or a little bit older, was when I really started to connect God to world events and seeking his hand, his provision. And so we had a strong president at the time. Some can disagree with that. But, at that time, it was a great show of patriotism. We all felt 9/11. We all remember where we were, what we were doing, and how we felt. And we were one. There was such a great power in being united. So I hope that something similar can happen right now, that this will help unite us a little bit in patriotism. With those who are just sold out to the leftist ideology, it's going to be a little tough. But I at least hope for those of us who are on the right and have Christian principles, this helps unite us a little bit.
I hope you're right. We are seeing a little bit of the Democrat response in terms of statements alluding to the fact that they have to be very careful because the Venezuelan people, liberty, have been suffering for decades under communist regimes. And that has shifted. And we know that, Maduro illegally, sort of took over several years ago. And then as recently as the 2019 elections, and then recently last year, he was outvoted 2-1, but remained. And so he is presumed to be the illegitimate president of Venezuela, which I think is a great response to the United Nations, who is coming out saying this is, an act of war, an act against a sovereign nation head. There's some legal loopholes here to say, well, was he the sovereign nation head? One, but two, even if he was, the United States has every right to prosecute legally, criminal foreign conduct. And so I think we're going to see a lot in the weeds there on trying to undermine, because, the Democrats are not going to be able to openly say we're against the Venezuelans getting their freedom, right? And many have had to have a mass exodus in order to survive a failing economy in Venezuela. Haven't they, Liberty?
Oh, yeah. I think if, just to check the vibe among Venezuelans, there are so many videos, both in Venezuela, in the United States, wherever they may have had to flee to around the world, celebrating in the streets, weeping with joy. You see, videos of statues of Maduro being toppled. And so for anybody who loves freedom and democracy, which we hope that we will see in Venezuela, that can warm your heart to see people cheering the absence of a dictator. So what's kind of been running through my head, which we can explore more later if you want to, Chelsey, has just kind of been multiple things can be true at one time. I'm glad that Maduro was arrested. I'm so thankful for our military and that they, all the members of the operation were safe. And I think it's going to be a little bit complicated going forward because now the Trump administration is going to have to figure out what to do in the meantime and how will that transition of power take place and can it be done successfully? So I think those are all the questions that a lot of people are thinking about.
Those are I'm glad you're putting some nuance on this because there's an entire nation now. While it is a positive thing to have this dictator out, he's been immediately sworn in and replaced by his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who was his close confidant and fellow, communist leader. And so there's an entire regime that's going to need to be taken a look at, and we'll get there right after this break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Mitt Romney, writing in the New York Times, proclaims, "It's time for rich people like me to pay more." Nate Jackson responds, "Feel free to write a larger check to the U.S. Treasury. Go right ahead. No one's stopping you or any other rich person." The editors of the Wall Street Journal agree, but also add, "Please spare the middle class trying to become rich." Before he was governor and presidential candidate, Mitt Romney made his fortune at Bain Capital. They say he can afford to pay more, but would the 28-year-old Mitt, still on the make, have thought so? Raising taxes makes it harder for others to get rich. The editors remind us that we have a progressive tax code. The top 1% of earners pay 40% of total income taxes. By contrast, the bottom 50% pay only 3% of income taxes. Mitt Romney does make some important points. First, he focuses on the carve-outs that benefit the wealthy. The tax code should be cleaner and fairer. He complains about the legal ways very rich people can avoid paying taxes. The Wall Street Journal editors remind us that billionaires like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are able to shelter their wealth behind tax loopholes. Mitt Romney also recognizes that programs such as Social Security and Medicare account for a majority of government outlays. He estimates that a third of government spending funds those two programs, yet they are headed for insolvency in the next decade. He deserves credit for talking about a program most politicians want to ignore. The U.S. government has a federal debt problem, but it isn't a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. Mitt Romney's comments later in the op-ed focus on the real problem. A simple tax code and entitlement reform are the true solutions to our debt problem. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Next Generation Roundtable, where Liberty, Patrina, and I are discussing Venezuela, and we're moving on now to talk a little bit more specifically about the response of the foreign stage. I think it's safe to say that Venezuela was under a communist regime, very closely aligned with China and Russia, both diplomatically, but also in terms of ideology, communist regimes. And China had been, we heard last night from a representative out of Florida, that China had many military expansions. They were physically located there in Venezuela. And so I want to talk about now, ladies, this idea that this is more than just an isolated incident where we're going to see President Trump being very strong on the world stage against Venezuela. It's more than drug cartels. It's more than protecting the American security interest, I think, in our own Gulf region, which he was doing over the last few months through many campaigns to, I think he openly bombed a port, and he sent our naval ships there to the region. Though that's all good and well, but I want to say it's safe to say that this goes beyond our struggle in the United States against drug cartels. This is really about ideology. When you have China across the world using Cuba, Colombia, we've got Mexico in our own backyard, although not communist, in the drug cartel rings, and Russia, they're all in talks and collusion with Venezuelans, with our neighbors in our own backyard. I think we need to look at this as a broader world stage. And the message is very clear to China that President Trump is going to take our security interests very seriously. And we're also seeing him make moves or discussions around Greenland. If you've heard that in the news, or maybe you have not, he said it is in our national security interest as the United States to have Greenland as a territory, not for any other reason than the fact that it's the last, if you look at the map, it is the last geographical location between Russia and China and their warships and the United States. It's a thoroughfare. And Denmark, of course, is renouncing that. But this is not necessarily about a global takeover, which I think we're starting to see the media discuss, because President Trump says, Venezuela and their oil, they're under our control right now until we figure out what's going on. This is broader than that because I think it implicates some of these worldwide alliances. Liberty, have you looked into any of this?
Yeah, it's interesting, Chelsey, because I'm definitely not an isolationist, and I know that kind of a growing base of or growing part of Trump's voter base leans more that way, being American first, and so America first. So I'm interested to see, what voters think of this, because all of a sudden we went from America first to, and as you said, there has been action leading up to this, but then now we're talking about, lots of involvement in other nations. And so I love displaying peace through strength and demonstrating the strength of America's military. I think it's a little bit ironic, maybe. And I know they said they were waiting on the weather, but Chinese diplomats were actually in Caracas and had just met with Maduro, and were still sleeping there when the operation took place. So if that doesn't send a strong message to China, I don't know what will. So, I'm not really sure what to expect, except that I'm just praying. I'm praying for the wisdom for our leaders, because I know there are a lot of things that the average citizen also doesn't see and isn't aware of in terms of threats from around the world. And we certainly want to keep our nation safe and protect our security interests, but we want to also do that in a wise way that protects American lives and troops as well. So I think there's a lot to pray about and just kind of be thoughtful and consider different perspectives over.
Yes. Well, Patrina, you know as well as anyone on the show, we talk a lot about international foreign affairs, and that's because they're so correlated and related to these instances where the media is going to really hyper focus on just Venezuela or the trial. They did appear for their arraignment in New York District Court, I should say, this morning. They pled not guilty. But the media is going to be focusing on some of these more, what I would say, localized aspects of this initiative. But Patrina, on a broader world scale, this sends a very strong message to world dictators who are already fighting multi-front wars. China is making moves in Taiwan. They're supporting Russia. They've got proxy interests in Iran. Russia is fighting in Ukraine and was also supporting Iran in the Middle East. And so these are all interrelated alliances. We're so familiar with NATO, but those international alliances have been moving and have existed for a long time in our own backyard, with even discussions that the Panama Canal, every single port I heard along that is basically owned by China. And so when we see President Trump very, very aggressively sending a message, I think in such a pointed way, like you said, that Chinese officials were there in Caracas at the time this happened. It's certainly something where he's hoping the world stage takes notice of. And I wondered what your thoughts on that, if you wanted to add, Patrina, are.
Oh man, there's so much there. And I'm so glad you painted it in such a way that these things are interconnected, and they certainly are. I'll start with my first thought, work my way down. But, in hearing this news, my first thought, of course, was the millennial aspect of it. But the second part was, okay, how does this look to our enemies around the world that it looks like we kind of cherry picked Venezuela to take out, knowing that we have all these other known enemies around, particularly China, who never paid for their actions in COVID and continued to rip off the world. So most recently, Trump got criticized this year about letting Chinese students into our universities, and him saying that he's going to keep allowing that because it will disrupt the stability of these universities financially if you were to pull that. And of course, a lot of us were thinking, well, they're disrupting our stability of national security. It's kind of worth it, don't you think? And so people like myself have kind of seen Trump soft on China, where they just don't seem to pay for their actions around the world. But like you said, I do think this was very strategic. And, with China, we are so economically wrapped up, us and the rest of the world, that you really have to tread strategically before you just rip the rug out from under all these financial investments. And with Chinese people, at least the leadership there, like they're communists, they're godless. It doesn't matter if you drop a bomb on them and just, go on your way. These people are godless, and they don't care about dying for the state. That's their every wish. So it's not a matter of trying to win a bloody war. You really do have to be a chess player and dealing with one of the greatest economic forces in the country. And they're a great economic force because they do bad trade deals. They suck countries into debts with them that they can never get out. So I think this is strategic. I think it's good. But I want us to get something out of it. I'm not one who will say, let's show peace through strength, the first choice. Just because of Iraq and Afghanistan, we got nothing. And we got a lot of broken men and women that have come back from that. So I say the first step needs to be, number one, Venezuelans that have come here as refugees need to go home. We need to get out, 15 million that have immigrated here since 2015. Number two, we need to get something. We need to control not only the lower hemisphere of the U.S. and oil production, but also get the Keystone Pipeline re-going again, that Biden stopped, that Trump initiated in his first term, and continue to work out deals with Canada so that we control both hemispheres and we're not relying on our enemies in the Middle East for oil. Mm-hmm. So those are the first two things. We need to control our hemisphere and make a great deal for Americans. And it seems like, for Trump's initial second term, he's all about keeping America safe and making good business deals for us. There's a lot of other things that I know we want him to do, but these seems to be the two primary actions for him, and I'm okay with it. But with we got to get something.
Yeah, his first year has been really strong, at least on the foreign policy context, if nothing else, which says a lot. I'll end on this segment on this note. Venezuela had also been actively seeking to get full membership into BRICS. If you're familiar with BRICS, it's the alternative world money to try to devalue U.S. currency. And it's right now members are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South America. They were denied a little over a year ago, but Venezuela was giving BRICS the oil as a backing, as a first priority before they were sending it out to the world. They also trade with China in the Chinese dollar to try to reduce the U.S. reliance. And so when I heard this, I immediately thought of this BRICS alliance and think, President Trump is often playing chess, not checkers, on the world stage. And this has so many more implications than, as I mentioned earlier, the drug cartels. It's also about preserving the American dollar and weakening BRICS, because those nations were relying on energy backing from Venezuela, which has more oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. It's exorbitantly hard to extract all the oil. They used to trade, 300 oil reserves, 3 million annually, and they're down to 1 million. And so Venezuela has slowly been depleted. I think President Trump is wanting to see them help keep BRICS weak, but then regain their strength nationally, we hope. More when we get back after this break.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now. Or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Chelsey Youman.
Well, welcome to the Next Generation Roundtable. We are turning our discussion to our next topic. We have a roundtable full of very intelligent women on this hour, and I'm so excited about it. So we chose some topics to talk about from our unique perspective on femininity being the first one. We saw that Liberty McArtor, who is the host of the Know Why podcast, had a really, I thought, insightful podcast. She did an end of year roundup, but one of the topics she discussed on her podcast was entitled "Neither Trans Nor Tradwife: Understanding the Truth of Femininity." And in the cultural wars we see around us, and would even call them gender wars, last year during the election cycle, we really fell into such a routine, I think, boring old narrative, which is woman versus man, is what the election resulted in, which I found disappointing as a woman, by the way, that we had, Kamala Harris running, who doesn't really represent anything I stand for personally, but that they fell into that old, arguments of we're going to make this all about gender roles. And I want to have a better discussion about it now. And so we're going to turn to that discussion. Go ahead, Liberty. I'll have you give us a summary and a background for your podcast, the topic you chose, set the framework, and then Patrina and I will dive in.
Sure. Well, this was part of our series that we did on the Know Why podcast towards the end of last year, which was Know About Family Formation. As you both know, there are declining marriage rates, declining fertility rates, a growing number of young people who are saying they're not even interested in getting married or having a family anymore. And so I really wanted to bust some of the myths that are out there about marriage and talk about the goodness of family. And then, how can you form a strong family from a biblical perspective? And so I interviewed Rachel Schroeder, who is a brilliant young woman, on this article she had written on trans and trad wife. And so when we get to the culture wars, and specifically talking to Christians here, it's so important to not just articulate what we are against. And a lot of times we see things that we just instinctively know are wrong. For instance, the transgender movement, radical gender ideology, the idea that you can, change your sex. I think a lot of Christians instinctively understand that that's wrong. And they see that, men and women have been pitted against each other. And so what you are also seeing is a reaction that, if you're on social media, it's called the trad wife movement, where basically women are attempting to reclaim femininity and kind of promote the goodness of what they call more traditional gender roles. But Rachel was so insightful in really articulating the nuance here that those are actually kind of flip sides of the same coin, because what the trad wife trend, especially on social media, does is really just emphasize aesthetics. I'm going to be a stay-at-home, mom or stay-at-home wife. I'm going to wear the dress and the apron, and I'm going to bake the food, and my husband's going to be the breadwinner. And, we're reclaiming femininity from the culture. But on the flip side, the trans movement says, well, if I put on a dress and an apron and makeup and I feel feminine, then I'm a woman. And what's missing from the conversation is an actual biblical understanding of what does it mean to be a man or a woman. And so that's what we talked about. And she, talks about you are a woman if you are biologically female, and the way that God made your body is not wrong. Neither are your interests and your personality traits, which may lean more masculine or feminine. And so it was a great conversation. I commend it to anybody, but I was so thankful to have that because I think it's a missing piece in so much of our culture wars today.
Wow, you hit on so many great things that Patrina and I were going to all dive in here. The first being, I like what you're saying about it. They both are all about aesthetics. I think that in many respects, what we're seeing culturally is this idea that we're not having a substantive discussion about women and their goals, or what's best for women or men, or what it means to be best for their family as a unit. But what we have this discussion is really limiting what we're discussing women in terms of what they look like, whether they work or not, in or out of the home. And I love that you said that part right there about what we're for, not just what we're against, because I think, Patrina, when I think of what the Bible has to say about the establishment of the family, I immediately go back to obviously Eve, and her name, which was Ezer in Hebrew. And in the Bible, Ezer meant helper. But it wasn't a weak form of a helper in a super submissive way. Helper was actually also a phrase used for the Holy Spirit. It's also a phrase that means rescuer. And it's used many times throughout the Old Testament to refer to neighboring strong countries that engaged to rescue Israel. And Eve's role with Adam was to really help him be what he could be, because it was not good for man to be alone, and he needed a helpmate. And so when I think of real femininity, what I think of is someone, whether they work in the home or not. I think we get really caught up on that in our culture wars when, we have decades pushing women in the workforce 8 to 5, or you have the opposite response, the trad wife response, which is, and I'll say Turning Point USA. I attended a conference, Patrina, with them. It was their young women's conference, and they pushed hard that women have really no place outside the home while they're raising their kids. And I don't think we have to fall into that bifurcation. I think the Bible says, when you look at the Proverbs 31 woman, she worked outside the home. She was a tradeswoman. She also, but your priorities have to be right biblically, right? And it starts there with first your marriage, and it extends then to your children, and then beyond that, it extends to these callings God has put in our lives, with those being the foremost. In my mind, Patrina, feel free to dive in on any of this.
Oh, yeah. This is such a good topic. And thank you, Liberty, for highlighting it in your podcast. I never would have thought to put those two things together either. But, as the conversation unfolded, it made sense. And it makes sense in a way that we as people, we try to hijack what God has ordained and recreate it into something that fits us. It's like when the people of Israel, they didn't know what happened to Moses up on the mountain, so they just melted all their gold jewelry and fashioned a god for themselves. And we do the same thing in so many different ways. And I think for those who are maybe tired of being the boss girl or the it woman, the CEO power woman, they're retreating back to I think I want to be taken care of. And that's okay too. I think there's a little bit of pragmatism there too, to be honest. Like, they want to be taken care of now because they see it's hard out there. And then secondly, this hijack is, it makes people focus on these outer equations, the dress, the makeup, the baking, instead of this inner vulnerability that gets you closer to God. And that vulnerability should be asking, what is God's purpose for my life? What is God's plan for my life? Because it may not be marriage. It may not be kids. It may not be all the things that even on the right, they tell you got to have as accessories to create the perfect life. But there's a lot more vulnerability and a lot more humility that comes in when you have to ask the Creator, what is your purpose for my life? And I surrender my plans to your plans. I think that is what we need to be talking about as Christians, not necessarily, the women should stay at home or the women should have part-time jobs. Those things, they're not salvific. They're not as important as what is God's will for your life. And there's so many scriptures that tells you exactly what God's will is: to be saved, to be sanctified, to not be filled with wine, but to be filled with praise. I mean, there's so many things we can start with, but that is a lot more vulnerable, right? Then let me just create a couple of equations and I get myself the perfect life.
Mm. Well said, Liberty.
Yeah. So good, Patrina. I think also it's important to recognize that we tend to have kind of a very narrow view, and we don't consider the whole of human history, and what many people are considering as the traditional setup where man goes off 9 to 5, woman stays home and takes care of the house. That's actually fairly modern in terms of family setup and arrangement. And so pre-industrial times, men and women and kids, they were all working together inside the home. And so, as you said, Chelsey, the Proverbs 31 woman is industrious. And so whatever nation or economy or time period we find ourselves in, just like Patrina said, our goal should be to follow the Lord and to seek His will for our lives. And that's going to look different across different times and cultures. And so those, cultural subjectives don't dictate what femininity or masculinity means. But Patrina was so right. We need to be focused on following the Lord, and then we will step into our calling that He has for our individual life.
Well said. I definitely want to stay here when we get back after our break in just a moment, because we let's dissect a little bit when we get back about more than just the culture war on women and defining women and men's roles, but more broadly, I would say this full campaign that I'm going to say we fight not against flesh and blood, so not just culture or politics or ideology, but we fight against kingdoms and principalities. And there's a very spiritual element here when you have decades of pervasive lies about women's roles with their husbands, but also their children. It cuts to the core of God's design for our society. So we'll get there right after this break.
listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable. I am so grateful you are spending your Monday after the holidays with us this afternoon. We are talking with Liberty and Patrina right now in our last segment of the first hour about the role. I don't know. It's everything. It's marriage, it's family, and femininity. And, you know, we all found ourselves, I think, generationally in the middle of giant culture wars, which I kind of want to hit on now with you ladies, is this idea that, you know, we've been told as believers and really as young women our entire lives that if you want to get married, not work outside the home, if you want to have children, that there's almost this I don't know, they turn their nose down at you about that there's this idea that you're choosing willful oppression to take a more traditional family route. And that, you know, we grew up in the age of shout your abortion, where abortion, this idea that women are pitted against their husbands who want to oppress them. Women are pitted against their children who will inherently limit their futures. It's all a lie. Those are lies to say that what it means to be a woman is to be able to make your own choices about whether or not you have your own children that are alive and growing and have rights independent of yours, even though they're unified with you. This constant pitting these people against each other has had lasting and damaging effect, I think, on our ideas of what it means to be in a family. At least for my generation, you know, we were 60 years into the Roe regime, and I have been told at family gatherings and at friends' kids' birthday parties that they can't believe that I hate women so much. I do what I do for a living as a pro-life advocate. You know, there's a stigma that comes when you're pro-life to saying like, well, maybe women shouldn't be pitted against their children. Maybe our best futures are designed to be growing together and to figuring it out together. And maybe being in a marriage can be a really happy, compatible companionship, lifelong building of society, that every family, society is built on families. That starts with our marriages. And that comes first, and that it is a good thing to pour into that, and to make it strong and to work at it and to grow together. That sanctification comes through this unification that God created and designed after Jesus and the church. That's the real example that we should set forward. And so we have a lot of cultural voices in our heads. But I wanted to really hone in that the enemy isn't the left or the right or politics. The enemy is Satan, who is saying he knows that a strong family unit changes the history of the world. You know, that Jesus came, you know, his very foundation came from a small, humble household, and that strong Christian believing families honoring the Lord are the biggest threat to Satan and his agenda. And that's one of the reasons the best thing we can do as believers, right, Patrina?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this is such an important topic and conversation that we're having. So I hope people really take this and discuss it with their friends or their close family members. Because, you know, I think about relationships, Chelsey, I usually say there's a lid for every pot. And in this case, it seems like Satan has a deception for every person. And what I mean by that is, you know, there are people who are in lockstep with, you got to have this formula of get the kids, get the marriage, get the dog, get the house, basically get the American life, but they don't have any power from God. And they may go to church, but they just got the formula. And so that's a deception sold by Satan to them. And then there's another deception that is, you know, let me just do the wife thing, the dress, the baking, the lipstick, and then I'll get what I want without the God part, right? This trad wife trend. It's like, no, you can't unfit yourself from Christianity and think that you're going to get the blessing of God. And there just seems to be so many different types of deceptions out there for each and every person that Satan really does have it covered. And that's why I'm so glad you mentioned the spiritual warfare aspect of this. That's really what it is. It's man taking the bait of Satan to create their own counterfeits, but denying the power that could actually make them godly, which is God. So we got to be careful when we hear these things. We got to discern everything through the Word of God, through the Holy Spirit that's within us. because, as we talked about on another show previously, we're just in an age of compromise. And there's many different types of compromises that are showing up in different ways, and there's a compromise made for each type of person.
Well, a lid for every pot. You said it so well, Patrina. Liberty, I'd love to get your response.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just what we always need to do is go back to creation and look at how did God originally design this. We have to remember that He created things in a perfect state. He made men and women whole human beings, and they were unified. They were created for each other to work together in partnership and care for creation and bear God's image on earth. And one of the very first effects of the fall, you see it right away, is there's blaming each other going on. And so, of course, the enemy wants men and women to be pitted against each other and the family to be ripped apart because, yes, that is so crucial to God's design, and it demonstrates God's love to the rest of the world. And so, but to kind of even specify a little bit more, one of the lies of our age, and it really comes down to idolatry of self, is, autonomy. The lie that we can be free and should be free from any sort of commitments or entanglements to anybody else. So this pits husband and wife against each other. This pits us against our neighbor. It pits parents against, and specifically mothers against children, because if you come to see any sort of dependence or somebody depending on you as an infringement on your right to autonomy, which is really a right that humans don't have, then you will want to get rid of that threat. And it is harming women, it is harming families, because it is causing us to view each other as the enemy, rather than what you said a moment ago, Chelsey. We should be supporting each other. It's not all a zero-sum game. And so I think and this is hard, especially for Americans who we do take pride in our independence. But as Christians, we have to remember that we are made for relationship with God, most importantly, but also other people. And whether you're married or not, that includes being there for neighbors, being there for your church family. And so I think kind of understanding that need for dependence is super important for the spiritual battle.
You are raising a really fine point there, because it also, I think, dovetails cleanly with your podcast, which talked about the tie-in with transgenderism, which is ultimate, really self-worship in a way. It's self-actualization, this idea, I define who I am, even as a creation. I can redefine who I am, and that self-worship is paramount and above all, but it's the antithesis of Christ's example, which I laid down my life for my brother. No greater love is this. And I came to serve and not be served. And I think that gets a negative stigma in Christian circles, discussing, submissive wives in the home. And that's not really what it is. There's a beauty to that partnership. It's called complementarity, where men and women were created differently, and that's okay. And they may have different roles, and that might look different for different relationships. But it's a beautiful thing that mothers are created inherently with a different EQ and for the home as a mom, and that dads have a different strength when they come home. And I know my 3 sons, who are wild, absolutely wild, respond very differently to my husband and his authority in our home than they do mine. But they sure do feel like they can tell me everything about their days and how they feel. And, we have that. That's just our example. Everybody has different examples, but that it's a good and beautiful thing to build something. Whether that's a marriage, your calling in life, and that these things are gifts from the Lord. Patrina, thank you for being with us. Go to pointofview.net, where you can look up her hashtag, her Twitter handle, and follow her, support her work. More after this break.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net, look at the tabs across the top, find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Chelsey Youman.
Well, happy Monday and welcome to the Next Generation Roundtable. This next hour, we have Liberty McArtor staying on with us. You know her well. And then we also have joining us is Ethan Watson. He is a writer and a Young Voices contributor. We are certainly grateful for his contributions to the Next Generation Roundtable. Thanks for joining us, Ethan.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
We have a great discussion ahead. We're going to be continuing to discuss really what is called in the New York Times the great detachment of family relationships and marriages across the United States culturally. It's a pretty growing phenomenon, actually, one worth discussing, certainly. But if you were not listening last hour, we were joined by Patrina Mosley, where we also discussed the regime change there in Venezuela and really what that means on the broader world stage. So go back and be sure to listen to it. You can also like us on Facebook at Point of View Radio on Facebook. And don't forget to go to pointofview.net, where you can read up on Kirby's commentaries. He always has such an incredible and a brilliant perspective on everything going on in the world around us. So wanted to make sure to let you know that you have a ton of resources at your fingertips at pointofview.net. But we are turning now our discussion to this article that Liberty and I were talking about in New York Times. It's called "We're Living Through the Great Detachment." And it sounds a little depressing, I'll be honest, but it's something that I think we need to talk about culturally, definitely as believers. We look around and this article talks about that dating is really at a record low among high schoolers. Marriage is at lower. People aren't having children at a rate worldwide even that's sustainable. The birth rate is no longer sustainable. And it's this idea that the attachments between us as individuals, and it used to be maybe our churches. They said synagogue. They talked about that too. Attendance rates are also on the decline. We've been talking about this erosion of connection between us, and our neighbors. And maybe we don't know our neighbors' names anymore. They say it used to take a village, and people say the villages are getting smaller, and that cell phones have led to a lot of this self-isolation. But this, I'm going to say, is maybe a bit of the next iteration of that type of isolation from communities. And that's even the closer connections, the familiar connections, less family, friends, less friends. And this idea of, self-autonomy to the extreme has led to a lonelier, more depressed, and more anxious generation. And the result of that is less families and kids. So, Liberty, you and I were discussing this a little bit in the last hour, more in the context of femininity and what it means to be to have femininity. We had an all women panel. So go listen to that. I liked our discussion, but we're extending this now into this idea of the great detachment in America, Liberty.
Yeah, it's similar to kind of what I was saying in the last hour too, but I think David Brooks has a great quote in this column. He said, you can build a culture around loving commitments, or you can build a culture around individual autonomy, but you can't do both. And we've clearly, as a culture, chosen the latter, and it has led to a lot of anxiety. And what's interesting that I want to point people to, they may or may not have heard of something called the Global Flourishing Study. And so it's it's actually a lot different than like the World Happiness Scale, which is published, and it's usually some Scandinavian country that ranks as like the most happy. But the Global Flourishing Study is really interesting. It was a 5-year project. It studied 22 countries across 6 continents, hundreds of thousands of people. And they calculated a composite flourishing score that considered health, a person's sense of meaning, the quality of their relationships, and more things like that. And when they looked at the countries that had the highest composite flourishing score, they were not the countries with the highest GDPs, but they did have strong friendships, marriages, community involvement, and high participation in religious communities. So I think that, again, is just more data for basically what Brooks is arguing in this New York Times article, which is we need people. And like that seems so obvious, especially when you go back to Genesis, like we talked about in the last hour. But humans were made for relationship. And when we are cut off from those relationships, then we're not happy. And so I think the Global Flourishing Study just really gives some like good, strong data for people to look at and understand that.
Very interesting. Ethan, what's your response?
Absolutely. I think this was a great piece by David Brooks. And this lack of connection is truly I think one of the biggest problems that our society faces. And as a early to mid 20s guy, I see this every day in my peers that have never been in a relationship at all, like in any way, shape, or form. And so they have extremely negative feelings about this. And when men start having really negative feelings about being in relationships with women, that leads to societal breakdown, because men without women is pretty ugly, pretty aggressive, pretty violent, and women without men is also not very good, right? Women without men are in some ways left defenseless. They struggle just like men struggle without their wives. And so it's a real problem when men aren't going out with women. And even when people do have connections, we have less connections than we used to have. And that's a problem, because when you have a dearth of connections, it strains the ones you do have. You become codependent and complacent, and it just creates toxicity. And I really think the problem here is everything David Brooks talked about, this idea of individualism and everything. But I think it's also social media. And with social media, young people have been trained to expect the absolute best perfection out of whoever they're dating. So we have a situation where the top 70% of dating prospects are demanding a top 1% match, right? The wealthiest, the most attractive, the most in shape. And I'm not saying you should settle, but you're never going to find someone who checks every single one of those boxes. And that has really led to this pickiness and disastrous effects in the culture.
That's really interesting that you said. I'm going to put some stats on this to compare kind of the dating decrease over the last few decades. In the 1980s, 85% of high schoolers were dating, and now less than 50% are dating. In 1993, 83% of senior high school girls said they wanted to get married. 83% wanted to get married. But fast forward 20 years, in 2023, only 61% of senior girls want to get married. That's a pretty big decrease. And I like what you're alluding to. There's several reasons. He discussed a little bit the economy and people under 40, particularly men under 40, who do not have a college education are not married. They're just not less than, I think, 50% are married, which is astounding. But it's more than the economy. He also talks, in addition, about this personal freedom and autonomy. But when it comes to Gen Z, which is really the becoming of marrying age, he talks about this idea that they're really focused on security, and they're an anxious generation. They're a cell phone screen generation, and they're adverse to risk and slow to trust. And that when you're talking about dating and relationships and marriage, I mean, it's all a giant trust exercise, and learning about people, putting yourself out there. You know, if you are a very anxious person and unwilling to trust, you're not going to be as likely to engage in really friendships, let alone, marriage and children. And so I think that could be a generational difference, Liberty, that he pointed out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think Ethan's right on with the effect that social media has had on the generation as well.
Very interesting. Thanks for the discussion. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Mitt Romney, writing in the New York Times, proclaims, "It's time for rich people like me to pay more." Nate Jackson responds, "Feel free to write a larger check to the U.S. Treasury. Go right ahead. No one's stopping you or any other rich person." The editors of the Wall Street Journal agree, but also add, "Please spare the middle class trying to become rich." Before he was governor and presidential candidate, Mitt Romney made his fortune at Bain Capital. They say he can afford to pay more, but would the 28-year-old Mitt, still on the make, have thought so? Raising taxes makes it harder for others to get rich. The editors remind us that we have a progressive tax code. The top 1% of earners pay 40% of total income taxes. By contrast, the bottom 50% pay only 3% of income taxes. Mitt Romney does make some important points. First, he focuses on the carve-outs that benefit the wealthy. The tax code should be cleaner and fairer. He complains about the legal ways very rich people can avoid paying taxes. The Wall Street Journal editors remind us that billionaires like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are able to shelter their wealth behind tax loopholes. Mitt Romney also recognizes that programs such as Social Security and Medicare account for a majority of government outlays. He estimates that a third of government spending funds those two programs, yet they are headed for insolvency in the next decade. He deserves credit for talking about a program most politicians want to ignore. The U.S. government has a federal debt problem, but it isn't a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. Mitt Romney's comments later in the op-ed focus on the real problem. A simple tax code and entitlement reform are the true solutions to our debt problem. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. We are discussing the decline in attachment, whether that be family and friends, marriage in the younger generations. It's really a historical decline. A few statistics I'll add to the ones we were just discussing that talk about the different attitudes towards autonomy in the realm of marriage and childbearing on this New York Times article. In the 1980s, there was a very little gap between the shares of liberal and conservatives, ages 25 to 35-year-old women who had children, according to a social survey. But by the 2000s, 71% of conservative women in that age group had children, compared with only 40% of liberal women. So that's a very historic 31 percentage point gap. Ethan, I read that and thought that was really interesting. I mean, we can talk and kind of pontificate about the cultural trends, cell phones, these endless possibilities you alluded to last segment, where, people are constantly have someone else that they can date. But some of these statistics indicate that there's just not a lot of dating going on at all, not a lot of interest going on. Feel free to give us your ideas on, maybe is it ideological differences here that could be at play?
Yeah, I think ideological differences are a huge part of it. And I think left-leaning women in particular have been conditioned to see children as a burden. I saw this clip going around of Chappell Roan a couple of weeks ago saying that everyone she knows that has children are miserable. And that's kind of how left-leaning women and basically left-leaning people in general tend to view having children. They see it as a hindrance and, oh, they're so expensive and they get in the way of my ability to go on vacation and go out and whatever. And maybe that's true. Children are expensive, increasingly so, and that's a huge problem. But we've lost this idea that having children is the highest calling most of us have and is really the only legacy that most of us are ever going to achieve. No one in 2 or 3 generations is going to remember what you did in your career for most of us, or, they traveled to so many countries, or they saw so many movies, or they consumed so much, content on streaming services. But what they will remember is your name, and they'll remember the family that you've created. They'll remember your progeny. And so we've got to get back to a point where we view that as valuable and acknowledge that that is one of our most basic instincts as humans and one of our highest callings that we can have.
It is. And I think conservatives don't always have, or Christians or people who have traditional family values, don't always have the same platforms, maybe in media. Maybe that's a part of the reason, Liberty, for this culture change or distinction, because, according to the University of Virginia, on average, married people report being happier than unmarried people, and find it enjoyable most of the time. And that's just, on the statistical side. But there is this idea beyond, I think, even legacy of, the depth of friendship, of companionship they talk about in marriage being the number one thing that people through all age groups love about marriage. And I don't know if we're just not getting the message out there that it is good to have children and get married and build roots and build something together, and to work, right? Because marriage is work and working on yourself. We talked a lot about this the last segment, Liberty, that people don't want to have to work on themselves because that's viewed as some in their way. But when I saw these political statistics, Liberty, it really stood out to me as a distinction. I mean, we're at a huge divergence between people groups based on potentially ideology. I'd love to get your theory on that.
Yeah. So, Institute for Family Studies has so much great research. And Brad Wilcox, who is with them, has his wonderful book, Get Married. And he has a lot of these statistics in there because we really do need to bust the cultural myths and speak the truth. So if you look at statistics, and yes, generally people who are married are happier. But the thing is, even in the church, I think we do a bad job of talking about the blessing that it is. I recently interviewed someone for that same series that I was talking about, the Family Formation series on the Know Why podcast. And she was talking about God's design for marriage. And one of the things she said at the end was that marriage is good. And she said when she first got married, only one person told her that. And I think, it's pretty common, people who, are newlyweds or about to get married. I know I experienced it. My husband and I, people be like, oh, get ready, and it's the old ball and chain, and they make all the jokes, and it's tended to kind of be funny. But really, that's the message that people are hearing from the culture. And then if they're hearing it from other Christians too, or conservatives as well, then that's a big problem. We need to be talking about the goodness of marriage and family and children. And they're not idols. Again, that's not ultimately going to make you happy. You need a relationship with God, and He may not give those blessings to everybody, but they are fundamentally, objectively good things. And again, it's good to have yourself stretched. It is hard. We can say, yeah, it's hard to take care of kids. It's hard to be married sometimes because you're not just looking out for yourself anymore, but that's also a good thing.
Well said. Ethan, I have one last question for you. And this was something else I saw that I thought was interesting. There was an NBC poll that asked young people to name their life goals. And this really defied stereotypes. Young men were more likely to prioritize family goals like getting married and having kids than young women. Do you find that to be true? And they said, among those who voted for President Trump, it was a top 4 goal. And then for those among women who voted for Kamala Harris, it was their 11th goal. And so I'd love for you to speak into that before we move on.
I absolutely find that to be the case. And the reason why that is because young men, our masculine instinct, which has been sort of suppressed and told, we've been told that it's toxic and that this is too aggressive and whatever. We want to be protectors and providers. That's how we're wired. We are not really built for domestic life, just to sit at home. We want to go out there and slay a dragon and provide for a wife and children. That's how most of us are wired, especially those of us on the right side of the aisle. And so as we've seen this sort of anti-male, anti-masculine rhetoric coming out of especially every institution, education, the media, the bumbling dad in the commercial, the Homer Simpsons. There's been a backlash of almost hyper masculinity saying, no, I'm a man. What makes me a man is my desire to protect and provide. And who are you protecting and providing for? That's a wife and that's kids in most cases. And so I think that's absolutely where that instinct comes from. I think that's a positive instinct, and that is what I mentioned earlier. I said men without women are no good because we're aggressive, we're mercurial, and having a woman and having children to take care of channels that aggression into something productive. And I think not enough people, especially to young people, are not saying that out loud. And that's something I truly believe and want to really hammer home.
Yeah, I've heard these murmurs, and I'll give it to you, Ethan, because we did have an entire last half hour talking about femininity and kind of the lies that we've been sold culturally. I am woman, hear me roar, shout your abortion lies that kind of really pit women against everything close and connecting for them, and tear apart the fabric of family and human society, which is the family unit. But we haven't heard yet. I'd love to get your perspective on what you're discussing, this anti-male rhetoric and demasculinity. Is it something that's really taken deep root, you think, rampantly or widespread? Because I think we all know our feminine experience, but to hear the male experience, I don't know that people talk about that very much.
Yeah, I mean, it starts from a young age, right, where you tell young boys that if they are antsy and don't want to sit down and read a book, that they probably have ADD and we're going to put them on meds. And it continues up into, the NFL when they have pride celebrations, or MLB when they have pride celebrations, and it goes into the books that we read in high school. I remember reading a lot of books that portrayed strong masculine men as the villains, and that they needed to be put in their place by women. And it goes to the movies that we watch where you see, some Mary Sue heroine beating up like 6 men twice her size with ease. It's all of these little things. Any one of them on their own would be no big deal, and you probably roll your eyes. But over time, there's been this idea that masculinity is, makes you bumbling and foolish and overly aggressive and mercurial. And that can be true, but it can also lead to some really beautiful things and is one of the building blocks of civilization. And this idea of toxic masculinity, it actually feeds back into why men don't date anymore either. Because we've been told that if you go up to a young woman and say, hey, I'd like to take you out, then you could be harassing her or whatever. Or that if she takes it the wrong way, then all of a sudden you're going to be called a creep or a misogynist or whatever. That scares off a lot of men. That scares off a lot of people that I know personally, because they're like, this is too much risk. I don't want to get involved with this. I don't want to be labeled as something, a misogynist or a chauvinist or a weirdo or a creep. If I, ask her out maybe twice, maybe I come back a month later and ask her out. I don't want to be labeled as some kind of weirdo. And I think that's really just had a chilling effect on men acting like men ought to.
Wow, I'm so grateful for your voice today, Ethan, on this topic. It's one that I really don't remember talking about on this show. And so to hear your perspective, especially for me, I'm a mom raising 3 very young boys, and I see this beautiful, wild spirit about them, this adventure in them. They need to rise. They need to rise to the occasion. And I, as the mom, constantly tell myself, let them, because it's hard as protective as I want to be. But to hear your voice on this, the result of the culture wars is division, but we get married, have kids, make those connections. That's the lesson of the day. Don't go anywhere after this break.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Chelsey Youman.
Welcome back to the Next Generation Roundtable. I am joined today by Liberty McArtor and Ethan Watson. We had a phenomenal discussion about culture wars, marriage, and family. So go back and listen if you have not already. You can read our topics today on pointofview.net or go like us on Facebook, Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Leave your comments and join our discussion. We're turning now really to a very different topic, which is the increase and expansion of Elon Musk's brain implantation company, Neuralink. And that's a really hard shift from our cultural discussion, but we're going to have that discussion because it's important to hear what these new goals are. I love to follow tech news. I think there's so many things happening so quickly. Kirby Anderson has really phenomenal commentaries on pointofview.net if you want to go read him and his coverage of why it's important to be following these types of things. First and foremost, I think where our world is headed involves a lot of integration of technology in the human person. The technical term for that is transhumanism. And there's not a lot of regulation or bounds or really even ethical limitations or parameters around let alone the testing they're doing on these things, but where this technology is headed to say, how much on the human person are we going to be integrated with technology? So we're going to start with Neuralink. You've heard me discuss this on the show before. It's a brain-computer interface device. And what that is they implant it into the human brain. I don't believe it can be removed. It's attached directly to one of the neurons there in the brain. And they've really only done it with 12 people across the world. And they've said it's originally designed to help people with conditions like a spinal cord injury, paralysis. But what it does is because it's a brain-computer interface, the computer device in the brain reads the brain waves, reads the brain activities, and can allow them to interact on computers. Or this one individual was able to play video games, browse the internet, post on social media, and move cursors on a laptop. Human trials began in 2024, and the FDA failed to approve the device in 2022. They denied that application because of safety concerns, but Neuralink got $600 million in June, is back with a vengeance, and they're going to be rolling out these devices really at a high volume production. And so their goal is to go to market. And then the other thing, I think maybe third, but I lost count, thing that they've done is they've entirely automated the surgical procedure so that instead of each individual having, a brain surgeon do the procedure for them, they say that they haven't told us what, but they've automated the surgical procedure. So these are some pretty crazy developments. Ethan, let's start with you. Dive right in.
Yeah, I think it's both wondrous and terrifying, these developments, and I think it's wondrous to the extent that this technology can help people live the most full human lives that they possibly can. If you have a paraplegic or a quadriplegic who can now, move around or better live their life on their own, because of Neuralink, I'm all for it. Automation, to the extent that it makes a surgery safer, more efficient, I'm fine with that. But what I fear about this kind of technology, Neuralink and ChatGPT, and really all of this wave of technology we're seeing, is that I think at a certain point it stops allowing us to live human lives and it starts making us something that we are not. It makes us live lives that are not human. And so ChatGPT does this because it writes our texts and emails for us. It communicates for us. It does the learning and thinking for us. And Neuralink is in that same bucket of technologies because from what I understand, Neuralink could in the future allow you to just download information directly into your brain. So all of a sudden, instead of having to learn and practice a sport or an instrument, you can download that. And instead of having to sit down with a cup of coffee and read a classic book, you can just in 5 minutes download it. Those are all really important, really unique, beautiful human experiences that I see going by the wayside. And the best argument I hear for Neuralink is, well, if people consent to having it in their brain, what's the big deal? You don't have to have it in your brain. But this consent-based morality is a real problem, because consent is but one of many elements, one of many boxes that must be checked for something to be okay, right? Consent is just one part of it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's okay. And just because someone else across the street or everyone around me consents to Neuralink, maybe I deserve to live in a society where not everyone is some lobotomized cyborg.
Wow, I love how much you're hitting here. Let's talk about. I'm gonna kind of organize this for why this is important, Liberty and Ethan. First, I think, Ethan, what I'm going to say is a benign entry point. This is how we're seeing technology. The invent of cell phone in everybody's hands, which when I was in high school did not exist, and now you can't walk down the street without everybody being absolutely plugged in and addicted to a device. There's a benign entry point. This technology is going to make my life better. It's interesting. It's just a tool. It's just a tool, which it is. But then there's a point where there's a reliance that triggers. And I think that reliance is a relinquishment of maybe willpower. There's no real reason not to, for instance, like ChatGPT is a really good example. I'm not going to use myself as an example because I don't use ChatGPT, but many people do. And, it starts with these questions that are really helpful, like a Google, a really advanced form of Google and information, but then, it builds your itineraries for your trips. And now we're asking it questions of ethics and morality, and it has no moral compass. And so it's almost this usurpation of your own ability to think and analyze that happens. It's like a gradual reliance. And then my concern would be maybe like a final stage, and y'all fill in the gaps for me here, which would be deception. So a device like Neuralink, they're saying, one, they have patented, this is going to sound crazy, telepathic technology. And so because it reads brain waves, it can then advertise to those brain waves. We've seen the World Economic Forum leaders discuss this ad nauseum, planting memories. They said someday you won't even have to go on the family trip. You'll just implant a memory of that family trip. That's deception. And so I want to talk about those, but feel free to add to it, Liberty and Ethan. Liberty, I'll start with you on, the parameters here or lack thereof, and any of these buckets you think are important to talk about.
Oh, yeah. I love this topic, Chelsey. I've been doing a lot of reading in the past year on AI, or the last couple years, too, on the Know Why podcast. It started out being like, wow, this is a really fascinating technology, to me really believing like, okay, we have got to draw some hard lines in the sand. And if our nation and our government's not doing that, then personally, we have to be prepared to do that. I think for a long time, and Christians, we tend to do this because we recognize that as human beings made in God's image, we are creative, we are inventive. So like Ethan said, it is amazing that this technology exists. Like, these are things written about in sci-fi novels up into even just like a decade ago that are now actually, potentially happening. And so we have tended to just view all tools as being neutral, and it just depends on how you use them. But I think we need to step beyond that and say, not all tools are neutral. And as Ethan said, if this is something that was very limited use for somebody who, was a paraplegic, for example, and it was just for that, and that was the sole motivation, then I think I would be okay with that. There would still be ethical questions there for the protection of that patient. But when you look at the motivation behind this, including these are like, Elon Musk has said he really views transhumanism, the combining of human brain and human body with technology, as humanity's savior against evil AI. So he is expressing concern about AI, and he wants to merge humanity with technology in order to beat what he sees as a threat. That's putting our hope and salvation in something that is not God. And again, as to Ethan's point, it is fundamentally unhuman. And so I know we're about to go to a break, but I get fired up about this topic because it is happening so fast. And we really do need to say, okay, where are the lines? What does it mean to be human? Where is this infringing not just on privacy, which is a legitimate concern, but our ability to live as humans? And I think that's a very real, practical question. And we're going to need to start drawing some personal lines and boundaries and say, hey, I'm not going to engage with this tool. Like, this is, the iPhone's my stopping point. Whatever your personal line is, that's where we are at this point.
Yeah, instead of sliding into it, deciding, is what they say, making these definitive decisions. We were watching a show and I had to turn to my sons and say, okay, guys, I know that this is really cool that they made him a robot, but is he better as a human or as a robot? And they were like, as a human, because we have to be teaching them. Maybe you can run faster, think better, whether it's outside of medicinal uses. I think we can talk about this category more cleanly. But those are very important questions. Is it better to have a device that is able to control you? Because if they can implant memories, they can implant opinions or fake news or value systems, belief systems, worship systems. There's not really a lot of parameters in place to prevent any of that. And so to say who has control and at what point are you handing that control over when you play with these devices, these are the value of humanity we're talking about. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We are continuing our discussion at the Next Generation Roundtable about Neuralink really going to market and doing a vast expansion they've announced in 2026. And this has turned into a discussion on transhumanism, which I'll define for you. It's a philosophical and scientific movement that wants to use technology like AI, genetic engineering, and nanotechnology to enhance, they say, human capabilities to overcome biological limitations such as aging, disease, disability, and some even going as far to advocate for a post-human state where humans have superior physical and cognitive abilities. And there's a whole host of ethical debates here. I will point out that Kirby Anderson has a phenomenal commentary on pointofview.net where he talks about the biblical view on genetic engineering, where you have children who are being genetically modified from creation to meet their parents' desires. And so, Ethan, there's so much to unpack here. We can talk about this idea of enhancement, longevity, posthumanism. But then I'll say this, there's also this idea, and I'll make a distinction for our conversation. Transhumanism is different than what you would call therapy, which wants like medicinal uses that want to restore normal function, and going beyond that to actually enhance or change human nature. And so that's kind of the distinction there, but it's one that's got a blurry line, Ethan. I'd love for you to dive in on any of this.
Yeah, certainly. And the reason why that line is blurry is because so many of our traits and attributes as humans can be viewed as something to be fixed, right? Like I'll use the ADD example that I talked about earlier. You can look at someone with ADD or ADHD and say, oh, well, there's something wrong with them. They can't focus. They need to be fixed. But when a certain number of people have that attribute, maybe it is really just a character trait. So you have to be very careful about what we label as something to be fixed with therapy or enhancement in the first place. That's beside the point. There's a lot of really, really good biblical arguments against transhumanism, and I think you guys have done a great job of covering that. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the practical and pragmatic arguments against it, because you touched on this briefly about how there are sort of global forces that would like to control us and, beaming advertisements or worse directly into our brains. It sounds like something out of science fiction, but that is sort of on the threshold, especially when you think about the technology that is already widely used. I'm talking about ChatGPT and AI, which we know already has its biases and is already being used for nefarious purposes. ChatGPT, for example, will produce imagery mocking Christ, but not Muhammad, the prophet. Grok on X will create images of women and even children in some cases in lewd situations. And there are powerful elites that would use this technology for evil. That if we found anything out from the Epstein files, it's that elites and powerful people really know no bounds to their appetites, and they will go to any lengths to satisfy them. And so we have to be really careful about the tools we let them have. One final point on this, talking about AI and how it has already impacted our life, is it has caused us to become a lot dumber as society. And that sounds very abrasive to say, but I've noticed it in my personal life. I've even noticed it myself in some situations. I used to know how to plan out meals for the week, and now I have ChatGPT do it for me. And it's really sort of taken away this cognitive ability that makes us less efficient and more dependent on outside sources of knowledge and information and critical thinking in a way that's really bad for us individually, but also bad for us as a society because it makes us susceptible to control.
Well, that, and it removes a little bit of the practice of analysis, right? And so thinking logically through problem solving, those are skills that require development. And if our education system, if you're, isn't helping us do that, that's something we're having to practice on our own. And so when you're starting to rely on an outside source to do the thinking for you, it reduces critical thinking skills. Liberty, you talked about how it reduces creativity as well, which is a bit of a unique human gift, is creativity and artistry. And that's certainly one piece of it. Other types of technology that would be an advancement when it comes to AI would be, we talked about merging the human mind with AI. That's something Elon Musk is openly advocating for. That idea you said that you could just download a book, and it's almost this. I wonder if it's making an idol out of knowledge and information. And we know that used to be the case. That's the original sin of Eve, right? And Adam, where they ate from the tree of knowledge. Is more is not. Is it always better? No, it's not. But it's not that we want to have the ignorance is bliss. It's more. I think natural. We, as we are naturally created and designed, is how God intended us to be. We're in His image, and there's almost this underhanded lie that comes in when you're talking about transhumanism that we're an unsophisticated creation, when the truth is we're made in the very image of the living God, and we're a very complex system in creation. That's why we talked about last month on our show. There's a new computer that's running in Australia, not off of silicone chips, but human cells, blood cells and tissue cells that have been donated because they're better processors. I mean, I don't think we can you think of the human eye and how we can see. I mean, humans are an incredibly developed creature, and the way we think and are wired. And then there's the emotional components, our moral components, our spiritual components. To say that that's a good creation is important as a believer, Liberty.
Oh, yeah. I think what I see with a lot of the AI and even this desire to, Elon Musk has said he wants to send a text without having to type with his fingers or even speak, apparently. He can just send it with his brain, or he wants people to be able to download information. There's this desire to remove any friction and see that as a negative thing. Well, we're just going to make it easy. And there's this argument that we can free up our minds for more creative stuff if we can just download the boring stuff that we, need to know. But there is a beauty in the process that we risk completely losing the ability for if we accept this. A frictionless life is ultimately not a satisfying life. And even in the Bible, we see that God teaches humans little bits at a time through question and answer, because ultimately the heart and the head are not meant to be separated. Head knowledge is one thing, but knowing something because you really wrestled with it and maybe you asked mentors and you learned it through conversation and relationship over time is a much deeper kind of knowledge. And that's what we risk losing if we try to eliminate all friction to learning through tools like AI.
Yes, and it's a hard thing to argue with because, medicine and pharmaceuticals, like those are inventions that are meant to help humankind and humanity. And so it's even hard for me to kind of grapple with why is this one, some of these developments distinguishable. And some of it is, I think I wrote this down, that it's a lie that we can transcend our own mortality. When you really get into some of this, the genetic modification, we can transcend diseases, there's the man who's spending millions and millions a year on becoming the longest living man on earth. And, it's really the ultimate escape hatch for people who don't have a belief system that we're going to be eternal creatures, but it's going to be in the spirit, and we don't have to worry. And I know that sounds maybe like a simple thing to say about it, but Ethan, I'd love to get your final thoughts on this before we close out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if there's any takeaway that I would say for really this whole hour of conversation is that it is a true privilege to be human and to be here on Earth for whatever our time is, and to make the most of that, and to not just experience the good parts of it, but also the bad things, the struggles that come with being in a relationship, or the pain that comes with forming connections with other people. All of that is authentic human connection. Being good at some things and bad at others, being a man or being a woman, those are all authentic human elements, and we need to cherish those and preserve those as much as possible.
Well said. Thank you for your time today, Liberty and Ethan. Go to pointofview.net and see how you can support their work. I'm Chelsey Youman. Thanks for spending your Monday with us.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.